A poem by Anonymous. The Christmas poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," was originally published as a visit from St. Nicholas in the Troy Sentinel in New York City on December 23, 1823. The poem was published anonymously with no name attached to its creation. Orville Hawley, the editor of the Troy Sentinel, wrote about publishing the poem anonymously. We do not know to whom we are indebted for the following description of the unwearied patron of music, that homely and delightfully personage of parental kindness, Santa Claus, his costume and his equipage, as he goes about visiting the firesides of this happy land laden with Christmas bounties. There is a spirit of cordial goodness in it, a playfulness of fancy, and a benevolent alacrity to enter into the feelings and promote the simple pleasures of children, which are altogether charming. Controversy. A Visit from St. Nicholas was published anonymously until 1837, when the New York Book of Poetry printed the poem and attributed authorship to biblical scholar Clement Clarke Moore. Clement Moore was a professor of Oriental and Greek literature at the General Theological Seminary from 1823 to 1850. Clement Moore would not claim authorship of A Visit from St. Nicholas until 1844, when he published a book of poems he had written and included it at the request of his children. In 1862, Moore explained that his poem had been originally published by a visitor who wrote down the poem from a copy made by one of Moore's relatives. The visitor had carried the poem to Troy and gave it to editor Hawley to be published. The visitor was later identified as Harriet Butler, who wanted to share the poem with her Sunday school class. Harriet Butler's father, David Butler, was a rector at the Diocese of New York, the diocese that Clement Moore was a part of. Orville Hawley, the editor who first published the poem, wrote in 1829 that he had found the original author and described him as by birth and residence belonging to the city of New York, and that he is a gentleman of more merit as a scholar and writer than many of more noisy pretensions. This is an accurate description of Moore. However, controversy would appear when A Visit from St. Nicholas was attributed to a different author, Henry Livingston Jr. Henry Livingston Jr. was a poet, although not well known, as much of his poetry was written for himself and his family. Livingston's daughters claimed that their father wrote the poem, and the idea of his authorship has been passed down in the family. The claim that Livingston was the author was not given much public attention until a grandson, William Sturgis Thomas, researched the poem for 30 years, trying to prove that his grandfather had written it. The Livingston family stated that Henry Livingston Jr. wrote the poem in 1804 or 1805 and read it to his children. The original manuscript was in the possession of the family until it was destroyed in a fire. The family also said that the poem was first published in a Poughkeepsie paper, although no paper to back up this claim has ever been found. Recently, the Livingston claim has gained ground through the work of Vassar professor Don Foster, who deployed linguistic forensics to determine who wrote the poem. Foster concludes that it was Henry Livingston Jr. Foster's claim that Moore could not possibly have written A Visit from St. Nicholas and that the style is more indicative of Livingston's has been criticized. Foster himself says that Moore had no consistent poetic style, but acted as a literary sponge. Foster's personal attack against Clement Clarke Moore and the fact that he only began researching the topic at the urging of the Livingston family questions his objectivity as a literary detective. At no time did Henry Livingston Jr. ever claim he wrote A Visit from St. Nicholas, although he did pass away before the poem had gained great popularity. The controversy and debate over who authored the famous poem still goes on today. However, for the sake of the rest of this list, we will be attributing the poem to Clement Clarke Moore, as existing historical evidence favors him. A gift to his children. According to Clement Clarke Moore's biographer, Samuel White Patterson, A Visit from St. Nicholas was dreamt up by Moore on the afternoon of Christmas Eve in 1822. Moore was in search that afternoon for a Christmas turkey that was large enough to satisfy his rather large family, including 6 children, and traveled to the market on his horse-drawn sleigh. On the trip, the poem took shape. Patterson describes the process. The muse of poetry is apt to be active under such circumstances, as Clement C. Moore knew on this wintry afternoon in 1822. Before he reached the gate of his broad acres, he had very likely composed his 28 couplets and memorized them. Not perfectly, perhaps. A change or two would be made during the recital. Whether it only took that afternoon to compose the poem, or possibly longer, when Clement returned home that evening, he recited his poem to his eager children and family. Patterson describes the children's reactions to their father's poetic gift. There is no need to be scientific to analyze the children's appreciation. It may be that Margaret at 7 appeared a little skeptical, that Charity at 6 was on the verge of doubt, but tried to repel her suspicions, that Benjamin 4 was the only true believer, that Mary, a year younger, was aware of a reality beyond her mental grasp, and that Clement, too, was somewhat fearful of St. Nick. Clement Clarke Moore's poem, created as a Christmas present to his children, would later become an endearing story that was shared with children all around the world. Mere Trifle. As stated earlier, Clement Moore was a professor at the General Theological Seminary, and perhaps his proudest work had been a Hebrew dictionary he published. The Hebrew Dictionary was a 2-volume set that he published in 1809. The goal of the dictionary was to assist in the translation and understanding of the Old Testament. In comparison to the Hebrew Dictionary, Moore regarded his Christmas poem to be a mere trifle, and beneath his dignity as an esteemed professor to have it officially published with his name. It was not until 1844, when Moore published his book of poetry, that he included A Visit from St. Nicholas at the behest of his children, finally claiming the poem as his own. Moore explains including the poem among with others at the beginning of his book. Another reason why the mere trifles in this volume have not been withheld is that such things have been often found to afford greater pleasure than what was by myself esteemed of more worth. In the introduction to a 1912 publication of the poem, the irony that Moore is best remembered for a mere trifle is eloquently described. Every Christmas Eve, the young men studying to be ministers at the General Theological Seminary, New York City, put a holly wreath around Dr. Moore's picture, which is on the wall in their dining room. Why? Because he gave the ground on which the General Theological Seminary stands? Because he wrote a Hebrew dictionary? No. They do it because he was the author of A Visit from St. Nicholas. Santa's size. Have you ever wondered how Santa Claus was able to fit down a chimney? Or how a sleigh and 8 reindeer were able to fit on top of a roof? Well, that's because originally Santa Claus and his reindeer were not full-sized. When St. Nicholas and his team are first introduced in the poem, this fact is quite apparent. When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. The small size of the reindeer is reinforced with the line, and then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. St. Nicholas is described as having a droll little mouth, a little round belly, and is referred to as a right jolly old elf, all of which confirm the size of Santa and his reindeer are considerably smaller originally. In an illustrated book of the poem published in 1874, there is a picture of St. Nick and his reindeer in front of the house. The reindeer and St. Nicholas, compared to the fence and gate of the house, are much smaller than normal-sized reindeer and humans. This difference in size explains how Santa was able to fit down all those chimneys and how his reindeer fit easily on top of the roof. Reindeer Names. Before A Visit from St. Nicholas was published, St. Nicholas did not have 8 named reindeer. How was Moore inspired to name the reindeer? According to Moore's biographer Patterson, some say that Moore had been reading Michael Drayton's poetry, of which he was fond, we know. Drayton's Nymphidia, a fairyland epic, gives Queen Mab 12 maids who very possibly suggested Moore's name for St. Nicholas's 8 tiny reindeer: Dasher and Dancer, Prancer and Vixen, Comet and Cupid, Donner and Blitzen. The similarity in the rhyming scheme to Michael Drayton's poem Nymphidia, written in 1627, is quite evident when the section about Queen Mab's maids is read. Hop and mop and drop so clear, pip and trip and skip that were to Mab, their sovereign ever dear, her special maids of honor. Fib and tib and pink and pin, tick and quick and Jill and Gin, tit and knit and whap and win, the train that wait upon her. The names of the reindeer are for the most part self-explanatory, except for Donner and Blitzen, which mean thunder and lightning. Influence from Washington Irving. Some of the imagery and mythology used in A Visit from St. Nicholas is derived from Washington Irving. Washington Irving was the brother of one of Clement Moore's classmates at Columbia College, and Irving and Moore were friends. Washington Irving's book, The Knickerbocker's History of New York, published in 1809, contained elements of the St. Nicholas myth that Moore would use. For example, Irving says that the sign of St. Nicholas was laying his finger beside his nose and winking hard with one eye, a description used in the poem. St. Nicholas's sleigh, his smoking of a pipe, and his giving presents to children are also present in Knickerbocker's History of New York. And lo, the good St. Nicholas came riding over the tops of the trees, in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. And he descended hard by where the heroes of Communipaw had made their late repast. And he lit the pipe by the fire and sat himself down and smoked. And as he smoked, the smoke from his pipe ascended into the air and spread like a cloud overhead. And when St. Nicholas had smoked his pipe, he twisted it in his hatband and laid his finger beside his nose, gave the astonished Van Cortlandt a very significant look, then mounting his wagon, he returned over the treetops and disappeared. The Children's Friend. Another great influence on Clement C. Moore and his poem was another poem written only a year before Moore would compose his own verses. The booklet, The Children's Friend, was written anonymously in 1821, but published by a former neighbor of Moore's, William B. Gilley. It is from this poem that the notion that St. Nicholas' sleigh is pulled by reindeer originates, although in The Children's Friend it is by a single reindeer, as well as the idea that Santa awards good children with gifts and punishes bad children, although he leaves a birch rod for naughty children, not coal. Another important addition to the Santa Claus story is that The Children's Friend was also St. Nicholas's first appearance on Christmas Day rather than the feast of St. Nicholas, December 6th. Accompanying the verses in the booklet were 8 colored illustrations, one of which shows Santa in his sleigh being pulled by a reindeer. Getting the right rhyme. Much of the imagery in A Visit from St. Nicholas has been explained. So has the rhyming scheme for Santa's reindeer. However, the poem would not have been a success if it didn't flow correctly. Moore used anapestic tetrameter throughout the poem, which means that each line has 4 metrical feet of 3 syllables in a rhythm of unstressed, unstressed, stressed syllables. Clement Moore's biographer Patterson has possibly identified the inspiration for Moore to use anapaests in A Visit from St. Nicholas. On December 15, 1810, a New York paper, The Spectator, published a poem that used Anapest, but was also about Santa Claus. The Spectator poem was written anonymously. Reading a short piece of the poem shows the similarity between it and Moore's own poem. O good holy man, whom we Santa Claus name, the nursery your praise shall proclaim, the day of your joyful visit return, when each little bosom with gratitude burns, for the gifts which at night you so kindly impart, for the girls of your love and the boys of your heart. 1905 movie. For over 80 years, Clement Moore's A Visit from St. Nicholas was read aloud to children before it finally moved from books to the picture screen. Released on December 16, 1905 by the Edison Manufacturing Company, The Night Before Christmas allowed children and adults to see Santa Claus in action. Although the film follows a visit from St. Nicholas, it begins with Santa feeding his reindeer. Real reindeer are used in the film, and also shows the children having a pillow fight as they are unable to sleep. Special effects are used to show Santa Claus riding in his sleigh. Miniatures were employed to create the desired effect. The film was directed by Edwin S. Porter, who 2 years prior had directed The Great Train Robbery, which is regarded as the first narrative film to achieve continuity of action and the industry's first real box office success.